I appreciate very much the chance to be with you today and the chance to do some work still in memory of my father. Rather peculiar circumstances. I think that Wendell mentioned the manuscripts were all turned in by all of the speakers last August. At least that's what he told me, and that's what we did. I suppose all the rest of them got theirs in. Or else we live so far away that we have to turn ours in earlier. I don't know which. And I am pleased that today we have two of the topics that will be two of the easier ones to deal with, actually, that will be in the book of Romans. And so I direct your attention to the first chapter of the book of Romans. Now let me suggest to you that when anybody asks you what does faith unto faith mean in Romans 1:17, that's a tip-off that they don't know what it means. And so I will direct most of my attention this morning to Brother Wendell Winkler, because that's usually a tip-off that if you have a topic like this, they really don't know what it means. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, verse 16, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For therein is revealed the righteousness of God from faith unto faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Well, this is a rather interesting passage that we want to try to deal with a little bit, that really sets the tone for the book of Romans. The entire book of Romans, as I'm sure all of you who are interested in this kind of Bible study at all understand, that there's a theme to this book that would be simply called justification. Now, in the first few chapters of the book of Romans, we have Paul dealing with the Jew and Gentile. First of all, he shows that the general principle of justification is by faith in chapter 1, and even cements this by a reference to an Old Testament prophet who suggested that this has been the case all through the history of mankind. God's never chosen anybody and has never worked with anybody outside the principle of faith. And then he proceeds in chapter 1 to deal with the sinfulness, that is, the need for justification for the Gentiles. And then in chapter 2 he deals with the sinfulness of the Jews particularly. And then in chapter 3, he seems to say all of mankind are unrighteous. There is none that is righteous. There are none but what have this kind of a heart and this kind of a mouth, and there are none but act in this way. And then from that time on, he goes on to point out through the rest of the book this great theme of the justification. Now, in your manuscript or in your book, if you happen to have it, I think you'll notice three real good points about the context. The context of this particular one in Romans 1:17, first of all, indicates that it is God's power to save. That is the gospel. Paul is introducing the gospel to these people. And he's going to talk about why can God be consistent and justify people the way he's justifying them. How can God be consistent with Gentiles? Is this not inconsistent with the way that he's dealt with the Jews all through the years? And then looking at the Jews, how can he justify the Jews when he hasn't dealt with Gentiles the same way all through the back years of the history of the world? And so he's introduced the gospel as it is the power of God to save. And with that in mind, he intends to point out that it is God's power to save. Secondly, that it reveals the righteousness of God. Whatever this righteousness is, we'll discuss in a moment. And thirdly, that it also indicates that if there is a righteousness of God, and if there is a gospel, there must also be a wrath of God. And so in the context, that's sort of the way we've got to go. Now, some of the erroneous interpretations, first of all, John Calvin thought that this meant you advance from one degree of faith to another. That's not particularly the most accurate way to look at the righteousness of God from faith unto faith. Secondly, Charles Hodge, a very astute scholar, indicated that he simply means faith alone. Thirdly, C.H. Dodd said Paul meant faith from beginning to end. And I suppose I hear more of my brethren quoting this one in substance than probably any other. Faith from beginning to end. Fourth, John Murray, in the New International Commentary that he wrote on Romans, says that it means the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ unto all that believe. Now, a number of others will say, like Conover, that it springs from faith and which faith receives. And then Knox says that it's faith first to last. The New English Bible points out that it starts with faith and ends with faith. Phillips' translation suggests a process begun and continued by faith. And Williams' translation says the way of faith that leads to greater faith. While several other translations continue these kinds and shades of thoughts. Now, let's look at, first of all, in the interpretation, what is revealed in the gospel. Well, first of all, it says that the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. Now, careful students of the Bible understand that it does not say the righteousness of God. Lest if it did, then we would be talking probably about an attribute of God. We would be talking about God in His own character. But since this does not say it that way, like, for instance, A.T. Robertson leaves it, that it is a God kind of righteousness, the Greek word here being dikaiosune, Thayer says, in this place, it's the righteousness which God ascribes, what God declares to be righteousness. Now, if we take the word righteousness to mean a right standing with God, and not a characteristic or an attribute of God, then we have the same idea that is involved in the word justification. And that really is the best way, and the least inconsistent way, I think, that we can look at this particular passage. Now, the verb form of this particular word is always translated justify. Why can't the noun form of it be translated justification? Most Greek scholars that I've read after, of course, all nearly take this position. Now, Moses Elard, the quote is given here. Moses Elard argues it this way. Dikaiosune is something done of God or of Christ. It is done for the sinner and not the sinless. Moreover, it is something done for the believer and not the unbeliever. It is conditioned on belief and is not done without it. Further, it looks to salvation and is essential to it. Previous to it, none can claim that salvation has occurred. Subsequent to it, none will deny that it has. Hence, in discovering the meaning of the word, we must find a sense which denotes something done for the believing sinner, prior to which he is not saved, subsequent to which he is. Consequently, dikaiosune in the clause in hand must mean to be released from sin or to be forgiven. It is then to be translated by justification and not, as Moses Lord says here, not by the word righteousness. And by justification in the sense of acquittal from guilt or the remission of sins. And if you have followed Moses Lord's commentary in Romans, you'll notice that nearly all the way through, he simply uses the word justification even in his translation. Now, in his commentary, he gives his own translation of the book of Romans from the Greek, and consistently he uses the word justification rather than righteousness. And so, actually, what would be read here is, for therein is revealed the justification of God. Now, does God Himself need to be justified? Not at all. But it is the justification which God Himself is willing to do. But on what principle? Upon the principle, the valid principle of faith. So therein is revealed the justification of God, is really the way we're trying to suggest that this word would be better understood. But next, be sure to notice that it is an act of God, and it is from God to the sinner. Now, justification involves two major things. If someone is justified in God's sight, first of all, their sins are remitted, and secondly, they're treated as if the sin had never happened. Now, those two things are involved in the term justification. And when you read the book of Romans, and when you study the book of Romans, I'm sure that you know that you must be extremely careful and meticulous in definitions. There is a difference between remission of sins and justification. There is a definite difference between justification and regeneration. There's a difference between justification and sanctification. There are shades of differences of meanings in all of these words, and so the idea of justification, if it's looked at correctly, will say that the sins, all of the past sins of the person are remitted, and secondly, that person will be treated as if it had never happened. He is looked upon as not having any sins. He is treated as if he had never sinned. Full forgiveness is, of course, involved in this. Now, next, justification is from faith. That is, it is on that condition that God will justify the sinner. Now, right here, many people begin to get really disturbed concerning this business of faith only. But there is only one principle upon which God has ever been willing to justify people, and that's the principle of faith. Now, please understand that I am saying there's only one principle. That does not mean there is only one condition. There may be other conditions. In fact, conditions have changed intermittently throughout all of history. The conditions that express the faith of Noah are different than the conditions that express the faith of Abraham. Noah needed to respond in the building of an ark. Abraham needed to respond in the firm understanding that he was, even as an old man, yet to be a father. The conditions of faith were different in many, many circumstances. But there's only one principle upon which God has ever been willing to justify somebody, and that's the principle of faith. Now, without it being heresy, I therefore would like to say that man is saved by faith alone. But I'm not speaking about a condition or an action on the part of man, as we would think about he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. But I am rather speaking about a broad general principle. And we're speaking about the quality of one's commitment and trust and assurance or faith in God. And without that principle, God has never justified anybody. And with that principle, He will justify you and me. Now, this is not the common denominational doctrine of faith only. Not at all. But I do want to make a very distinct difference. That there's only one principle upon which we have ever been saved. And here it is announced. It is the principle of faith. Now then, thirdly on this, that faith is that which is unto faith. As we go to the last part of this, I think we can find a little bit easier way to say it, which actually, as he gives the illustration here, if a man comes up to me and says, I have good news for you, well, what is it? He says, well, I will give you, or I'll let you understand that God will give you justification or a right standing with Him if you will never, never, never commit another sin. If you live a perfect life from here on out, then you'll be justified. Well, now, I don't know whether that's very good news to you or not, but it wouldn't be very good news to me. But if God were to come to me, or some man were to come to me and say, God will justify you, and God will forgive you, and God will put you on a right standing if you will trust in Jesus Christ completely. If you will have a committed faith to the Lord, so that salvation will be possible to you, then I think that would encourage me to have some faith. Now, the ramifications on down the line will not always mean that I have to live a perfect life. Neither does it mean that I will be given a license to sin. No. But it simply is the idea that if I am told the principle upon which God is willing to justify me, that it ought to motivate me and induce me to want to have that kind of principle in my life. Therefore, when I am told that if I will, by faith, put my life in the hands of the Lord, He will justify me and will see to it that everything continues in my life. Now, of course, you can't leave out the rest of the book of Romans for the full expression of this later on, because there's a great chapter on sanctification, which is the 8th chapter, and then there are great expressions of applied sanctification in our lives, which begin in the 12th chapter, going through the end of the book. How to put this into personal use in our life. And so to isolate this and say, no, it's just faith only in the denominational sense is way out of context. But to have the idea that you and I can be perfectly equipped by God unto every good work and be saved, in spite of the fact that with our human frailties and weaknesses, we're going to fall, we're going to come short, we're going to occasionally do those things that we know that are wrong, we're going to lose control of ourselves in some ways, and it's sometimes in our lives, and we know we're going to sin. Yet in spite of that, God is willing to justify us and provide for us that there are those circumstances of life that will see to it that we can live a life consistent with that faith, and that will be that upon which He will justify us. Well, let's look at it. If we separate that phrase from faith unto faith from the rest of the sentence, we're not likely to get the meaning. Because it really means the righteousness of God from faith, which is unto faith. And so when you separate off and say, what does faith unto faith mean? You've really taken away one great possibility of even learning what it's all about. Well, the second passage that I would like to suggest to you today is the 2nd chapter and verse 14. And let's begin back in verse 12 in order to get just a little bit of the context. For as many as have sinned without the law shall also perish without the law. And as many as have sinned under the law shall be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. For when Gentiles that have not the law do by nature the things of the law, these not having the law are a law unto themselves, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience bearing witness therewith, and their thoughts one with another, accusing or else excusing them. In the day when God shall judge the secrets of men according to my gospel by Jesus Christ. Now let me suggest to you that if you want to get the context, that you read verse 12, 13, and 16. Because there is a parenthetical expression in verse 14 and 15. So look at it like this. As many as have sinned without the law shall perish without the law, and as many as have sinned under the law shall be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified in the day that God shall judge the secrets of men according to my gospel by Jesus Christ. Now that's the context. And he's speaking here to the Jewish people, but answering in a parenthetical statement in verses 14 and 15 the position of the Gentiles during all of this time. Now the Jews have no problem about their position. I mean, Paul just simply says, you had this written law of Moses, and there's no problem to you about this. But if you want to get the idea of what happened to the Gentiles, then here, I'll give you just sort of a little parenthetical statement. That's verses 14 and 15. Now, I do not know whether your translations that you're using particularly have those verses in parentheses, but the American Standard does, and I think more of the reputable ones do. Now then, let's first of all notice some things about this by way of introduction. Number one, God has never left anybody without a rule of conduct. Now that's what law is. Don't mix up what a law is. In later passages, in further mornings this week, we'll be talking about what a law is. A law was never given to justify people, but a law is a rule of conduct. And so God has never left men without rules of conduct. And if He had, then secondly, people without those laws or rules of conduct could not sin. Romans 4:15 says that where there is no law, there is no transgression. And we're told by John that sin is a transgression of the law. So we just cannot come to the conclusion that God has ever left men without rules of conduct and law, or else we have God having left men in the position of everybody being saved without any possibility of ever being lost. That would be a sort of a twisted and perverted version of universal salvation. Now, in its context, number one, I would suggest to you, he must first of all show that the world is convicted of sin. That is, Paul is showing that the world is convicted of sin. In Romans 1, he deals with the Gentiles. In Romans 2 and part of 3, he deals with the Jews and then makes a general application in 3. And in verse 21, he said, as many as have sinned without the law shall perish without the law. He doesn't mean that the Gentiles were without any law in every sense. If this was true, then of course they could not be guilty of sin. But they were without the written law. Gentiles who were without law, meaning the written law like the law of Moses. So far as I know, there is no indication whatever in the Bible that anybody ever had a written law prior to Moses. I'm not aware that God wrote anything down to Adam and Eve. I'm not aware that God wrote anything down as rules of conduct for the pre-diluvian world. Yet they were sinful and were destroyed. I'm not aware that he wrote down anything for Noah. I'm not aware that he wrote down anything for anybody until it came to the Jewish people. And I'm not aware that he even wrote down laws in codified form of any sense, even for people all during those 1,500 years of the law of Moses. Yet he had many relationships with them. So here when he says that the Gentiles were without law, he does not mean without all and every sense of law, but they were without the written law. Please make that distinction, and I think it will make it much easier to see. Now, secondly, he says this in order to correct an erroneous view that evidently had come up to the Jews. After all, what did the Jews think the law was going to do for them? Justify them. They were going to be justified by their law-keeping. And if they washed enough pots and pans in the day of Jesus Christ, they thought they were going to be justified. Oh, they kept all of the feast days. They kept the Sabbath. They kept the various years. They even invented all of these extra washings. Oh, yes, they were very, very meticulous about this. They were very meticulous about tithing. And Jesus even rebuked them for tithing mint and anise and cumin and leaving undone the weightier matters of the law, justice, faith, and mercy, in Matthew 23. And so they were very zealous and very meticulous about this because they thought that by that law-keeping they would be justified by God. Paul says, no way. Now you who think you're going to be justified by law-keeping, you're wondering about what in the world is going to happen to these Gentiles. While all along you ought to realize that you're going to be saved exactly alike, on the same principle and upon the same situations. You'll be saved exactly alike, and that is the principle of faith. The conditions may vary, but the principle will not. Well, he corrected, therefore, this idea of the Jews because they thought they were going to be saved by their law-keeping. And therefore, if that were true, then the Gentiles had no hope whatever. All Gentiles would just be lost because they did not have the law. Now, here's some erroneous interpretations about it. First of all, to prove that the Gentiles were not under law. Some people try to prove that as a result of Paul's statement here that since they did by nature the things of the law, and the works of the law were written on their hearts, that they became a law unto themselves, then that would prove they had no law whatever. But not so. If there is no transgression, there can be no sin. 1 John 3 and verse 4 and Romans 4 and verse 15. And yet Paul had just proven that every Gentile stood condemned before God. Therefore there must have been some kinds of laws that they had broken. Now, Brother James Bales has taken this position with reference to marriage and the rules that regulate marriage. Unfortunately, he has taken that position because he suggests that when Adam and Eve sinned, they were under God's covenant. And when they sinned, they broke that covenant, which included their marriage covenant, and that covenant was never renewed. And therefore, there has been no marriage law or covenant from the time of the sin of Adam and Eve until the time that Jesus put it into force on Pentecost. That seems to be the logical ramifications of that kind of an idea. But I suggest to you that that is an erroneous interpretation. Now, I believe that's a quotation in your manuscript or in your book from his article in the Firm Foundation. Secondly, an erroneous interpretation is that the Gentiles had a law written on their hearts. How many times have you heard people say that the Gentiles had a law written on their hearts? The Bible doesn't say so. Oh, yes, it does. No, look very carefully. It said that they show the work of the law written on their hearts, not a law written on their hearts. Now think with me just a moment. If they had a law written on their hearts, then they would not need anything else now, would they? If they had a law written on their hearts, then there was no problem of communication, was there? Because God would have had to have done the writing. And the law that was on their heart would have been perfect. And they would have had perfect knowledge of exactly what God intended for them to do by law. So what difference did it make about their conscience? Well, these people would come along and say, well, their conscience will either approve or disapprove them because God wrote the law on their hearts. But that just is not the Bible description. The Bible description is that God's law was written to the Jews. And when the Gentiles saw that and understood that, or found in some other way those exact same principles, then they obeyed those things. They showed the work of the law written on their hearts, not a law. And that's a very, very careful distinction that we ought to make. Now, Thayer says the work of the law, the course of action demanded by the law, therefore not the law itself, but rather the course of action, the work of the law. Now, it'd be very hard to explain why Gentiles had prophets if the work of if the law were written on the heart. Why was Melchizedek a king and priest both at the same time if they had a law written on their hearts? Why was Balaam a prophet if they had the law written on their hearts? Why was Jonah sent to Nineveh if they had the law written on their hearts? There would be no need for it. The reason for prophets is to speak for God. And though we do not have full account of all that happened in Old Testament days, yet there are some marvelous and exciting glimpses that God had a relationship with the Gentiles and with various nations and peoples and families all throughout the Old Testament. But, you know, the Bible is just the record of how God brought justification and redemption to man. And since that was brought through the Jewish people and the line of Christ, therefore we really don't have a full account of how God had always dealt in every place and every century with all of the other people. And this is one of the stumbling blocks in the book of Romans in understanding it properly. Well, what is the true interpretation of it? First of all, for when the Gentiles, verse 14, it does not say the Gentiles in the sense of every Gentile and all Gentiles. Is Paul affirming here that every single Gentile was doing what was pleasing to God? No. Is he affirming that all of them together as a body were doing it? No. It's as if he says, but when any Gentile does it, then it can work this way for him. Then it says, not having a law. Again, let me suggest this does not mean any law, but the written law. They did not have a written codified law as did the Jews. Thirdly, when they do by nature. Barnes has an interesting comment here, I think, when he says that they could learn many of these things by tradition, conscience, reason, or observation. And when they did, then of course their consciences would either accuse or excuse them. Large suggests that this means that they did by nature without a written law, not necessarily nature wholly enlightened by divine truth. This is not the idea that they did these things without any flaw or any fault or any mistake. But it is simply the fact that when a Gentile was able to come up to a knowledge, whatever way he got it, of the law, and did those works in his own life, then God would accept that, just like he would accept to the written law to the Jews. And then he says, the things of the law. Things would be equal to the requirements or the commands that would be involved in the law. And next he says they are a law unto themselves. Does this mean that they're free unto God to do anything they want to? Does this mean that every man's conscience is his God and his guide? Not at all. But rather when they, in their own ability, by observation or tradition or prophet or whatever, are able to come up to that standard of God, goodness, and morality, then they can be accepted by God at that point. Up until that point, they are not. And it does not mean that just whatever came into their own conscience, and if they excused themselves by their own conscience, that being a law unto themselves, it was all right. Oh, what a terrible, terrible application this would have in the marriage and divorce problem, if we do not look out for the practical application of the wrong doctrine on that. Then they show the work of the law. That does not mean, be reminded, all Gentiles, but he does affirm that Gentiles do show some amount of the work of the law written in their hearts. This word vine says, ergon, works, frequently occurs in an ethical sense, human action, good or bad, like Romans 2:7 and 2:15. So Paul is not affirming that all Gentiles are a law in themselves, but only those Gentiles which who did the things of the law. Well, those Gentiles who knew the ordinance of God but refused to have God in their knowledge and practice the sins that Paul mentioned in chapter 1 were not a law unto themselves and did not show the work of the law written in their hearts. Just as simple as can be. Now, the erroneous idea that all Gentiles are under a law written on their hearts is being used today by some brethren to prove that a non-covenant people, that is, alien sinners, are related to covenant people, Christians, in the same way that Gentiles are related to the Jews before the cross of Christ. Now, there are some ramifications of this that are going to pose a ridiculous conclusion. If those who supposedly are not under any covenant before God do not have to live by the way that God wants them to live and is expressed to those of us who are Christians, but if it doesn't apply to any of them, we've got a problem. What about children who are 15, 18 years of age in a family situation who have no teaching by God because they are not Christians yet that they should obey their parents? Then can we preach to those children that they should obey their parents? They're not Christians yet. They have no covenant with God yet. You see? What about a wife who is not a member of the church and the husband is? That means that he's living with a wife who has no obligation whatever to be obedient to him because that's part of the commands of the Lord for those within the covenant. Well, how ridiculous. You see, the home is a separate institution, and we need to make this situation understood. The home is older than the church. The covenant of the home is older than the covenant of the Lord's body that was given for the church today. And I deny, and I believe most of you would also understand that we must deny that when Adam and Eve broke the covenant with God concerning the circumstances of the Garden of Eden, that they broke a marriage covenant and it was never renewed, and therefore there has been no covenant whatever for any men at any time. That leaves an almost unthinkable conclusion that everybody who's not Christians are just mating like dogs in the woods, and I'm wondering what in the world we're going to do about them when we baptize them into Christ. We've got to do something about their marriage relationship also. Let's not misapply Romans 2:14, that when the Gentiles do by nature the things of the law, they have the work of the law written in their hearts, and they thus become a law unto themselves, only as much as they rise up to the standard which the Jews already knew about because of their written law. Therefore, I would like to leave with you these ideas on these two relatively simple scriptures. We'll have to deal with some harder ones later on this week. But the first one is that within God's scheme of redemption, there is revealed God's way of justification on the principle of faith, which will induce men to believe. And that these Gentiles could sometimes learn, some of them, those moral precepts and principles, and if they would obey these, it would bring them up to the same standard and serve for them in their situation exactly what the written law served for the Jews in their situation, and thus God would accept that, and in that sense, Paul said they would become a law unto themselves. Thank you.